I'm going to call you on the stage. Reiner Kraft is the VP Search and Recommendation from Zalando. He'll be interviewed by Ed Shelley from Chartmovie.
To be talking to Reiner here, who, from what I understand, is doing some really interesting things at Zalando and has been for quite some time. This is a fireside chat. I don't think we need the fire because it's already about 30 degrees, but that means it's a session for you guys. And so I have a few questions here in my notes, but after that we'll open it up to the floor. So if you have anything in your head or maybe collect as we're going along your questions for Reiner, I'd be happy to put them to him in the second part of this. So let's get started. Reiner, I would love to start with the simple part, I guess. Could you just describe what you do at Zalando, what your job is there?
Hey, yeah, thanks, Ed. So, yeah, my name is Reiner Kraft. I joined Zalando about a little bit more than a year ago. The past 20 years, actually even longer, I lived in the Silicon Valley, Bay Area. I worked at IBM Research before, at Yahoo, usually working on topics that require a combination of research and engineering. And then when I joined Zalando, my focus area was really of building up research, search, personalization, and pretty much looking at AI, at the bigger picture of AI, what the AI strategy is, and what we can do in the area of fashion to really innovate. So those are some of the major areas.
From what I understand, you have a very deliberate effort into research at Zalando. What does that actually look like in terms of the organization?
Yeah, so when I joined Zalando at the beginning, we already had close to 100 researchers and data scientists, but there was no real particularly organization around them, and that was one of the problems. I think the first thing when looking at this, usually what you have to do in bigger companies, you have to see how do you organize research in a good way that is effective. And for me, there is a balance between short-term research, so research that you address more towards immediate deliverables, and then there is also more longer-term research that is usually high risk, but high return. To do that, we have established Zalando Research last year. Zalando Research is basically a real research lab with more long-term goals. And we put really strong senior research scientists into this lab to focus on hard problems in the area of machine learning, AI. But in addition to this, we have still, I think at this point, even more than 100 research engineers and data scientists who work in engineering teams. And they work a little bit more on the short-term focus. But there is a good collaboration that we have established between the research lab and the researchers in the teams. For instance, we have a data science guild that is overarching across both of them. And so that way we can get basically the best out of both worlds. We can make some immediate progress, but we can also look a little bit strategically at longer term kind of projects.
Yeah, and obviously that's a significant effort and a significant size team you have. Yeah. I think for a lot of people from the outside, it's very easy to look at Zalando as purely a fashion e-commerce brand, and they might be surprised just how deep your efforts go. What are some of the areas that you're pioneering in the research area? Like, what are your focuses there?
Yeah. There is basically on the research side, we're looking more in, as I mentioned earlier, strategic projects. There was a talk earlier from Mikio, like in the morning, he was talking, one of the bigger projects he was talking about was Fashion DNA. That is an example of a really more strategic project, but is already coming up with a lot of good results out of this, where we're basically looking at how we can represent fashion in a way that we can prevent, for instance, what we call the cold start problem in recommendation. Like if you don't have a lot of data yet, but you still want to make some recommendations, something like Fashion DNA can help. Another bigger effort is also more strategically long-term is something like a virtual try-on. I think that is a kind of cool thing, because a lot of the times when you think about fashion, you basically want to try it on, right? And of course we have a model currently that we ship the thing to you, you get a box, you can open it, try it out, then you send it back. But there should be ways with AI and with the technologies now that are available that you have basically a digital model of yourself uploaded and that you can now try fashion on and see how it looks and play with it. And so those are projects that are a little bit more, still require more time, but there's some good results initially there, right?
So it's pretty clear that personalization, search, and kind of optimization of the experience are like key areas that you kind of, parts of the product that you touch. Is there anything else that maybe we wouldn't expect so much where you're using AI at Zalando to kind of get ahead of the competition?
Yeah, I mean AI you can pretty much embed everywhere in the company. There is, so if you look at the different areas, for instance, we have big logistics warehouses. So you can already see there is ways to optimize logistics, right? Then there is supply and demand, right? Figuring out how much supply do we need, for instance, of particular T-shirts. What is the best price? So pricing forecast and pricing prediction, those are all different areas. Another one, for instance, is also a very hard one, is sizing prediction, figuring out what size actually someone needs. And so this way, for instance, of course, if you always recommend the perfect size, right, then you can decrease, for instance, returns, and users are more happy, right?
So I think another theme there is like it's all about reducing friction, if I'm right, in the experience of the end user, right? If you already know what size I want and if you already know what kind of preference I have, then the whole experience for the user is infinitely better, I guess. Yeah. What do you see changing in the near future for the use of AI? You obviously have this kind of longer term play. Are there things that we are just not thinking about now that you guys are already working on there?
Yeah. So you mean in which area, in terms of?
In terms of implementing AI in e-commerce, perhaps there are parts that today it's just not feasible to actually embed in the product or to roll out. But I'd be really, I mean, obviously there are things I'm sure you can't talk about, but I guess on a broader level, if you could say perhaps what you would like to see in 5 to 10 years in the e-commerce space that is powered and enabled by the use of AI.
Yeah, I mean, there is in the general e-commerce area, then of course there's the fashion area. I see, for instance, with the rapid evolvement in particularly, for instance, last year when you see the cloud, AWS, Google, cloud-based GPUs, you see all this computational power basically to you available at the fingertip, where a few years ago you had to basically build up big clusters of machines and maintain them, which makes it really hard. Nowadays, everyone literally can just go there, set it up, and get some deep learning going, if you of course know how to do it. I think this trend will continue to evolve, that we see more and more cloud-enabled also tooling, making still a lot of hurdles from using the cloud, so getting more and more tooling going. So making this all easier, then in parallel the increase in computation and storage, all this of course accelerates at a rapid exponential pace. So that of course will have a significant impact, I would think about, in terms of what type of applications will come out in the next few years. I think we're just at the very early start, because people are still ramping up on some of those things and playing with it and experimenting. But in a few years from now, you will see the first, second generation of those efforts. But even looking out 5 or 10 years, it's really hard to predict what will happen, right? I mean, at this speed. Right?
And obviously, Zalando has a lot of resources to put into this, and you have some very smart people working on these problems. Would you say that these technologies are becoming more accessible today? Like, what can a startup, a small startup, do today? Perhaps not as far as you're going, but at least in the same direction. Is that becoming easier?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a startup, it's perfect timing now, right? I think with all what I mentioned in my previous comment about all the cloud resources that are now at your disposal that you can leverage, I think the key thing for the startup is you have to have a good idea. And of course, then the resources in terms of making it happen from a machine perspective, GPU perspective, and all those things are given. It is really back then at the end of the day to the talent that a startup who really wants to get serious in this topic, they need really some senior, someone in there, a scientist who really knows how to use those things, and usually some creative engineers around them as well. And I think this is then when everything comes together, when the innovation sparks.
Yeah.
Right?
What's your secret for attracting all those clever people?
Yeah, so I think the hiring and talent is usually when you ask anybody in terms of what are one of the hardest challenge, it is really finding the best people. And the reason is that usually the best people working in these areas, they're not idle and sitting somewhere and waiting. They're usually working on some challenging problems. They have maybe a good position currently in a company. Maybe they already work in a startup. So it's really, so how can you basically become interesting for them as a company, right? And usually the way I think about it is if the company is doing, any company, right? If you're doing good work and you're sharing the work that you're doing, and you can share them in terms of, for instance, like the research lab, you publish papers, right? If you're working more on the engineering side, you may write some tech blogs, or you basically open sourcing. There's all kind of ways of sharing. It's all about sharing, right? And then I think at the end of the day, if people see that there is some interesting work coming out of these areas, that they get inspired, that's usually when it comes on their radar. It doesn't mean that they now jump immediately and come to you, but I think it's basically building up a good reputation. It's about openness, sharing, and then at the end of the day, the vision, right? That you can actually give them a vision where they can buy in, which makes sense and which is challenging, right? Otherwise, usually researchers, they don't want to work on small problems, they want to change the world. So you have to offer them something that is actually that inspiring for them to come, right?
Yeah, I think that's probably good advice for people looking to hire pretty much any good talent.
Yeah.
I think that's great. Just looking forwards for the fashion industry, obviously you have the goal of really changing the industry at large. What are some of the challenges that are unique to what you're doing in fashion that perhaps you might not see elsewhere in technology?
Yeah, I think in fashion, one of the biggest challenge I see is that a lot of the actual sales, they're happening offline, right? So if I look at, let's say, the older generation, like people like, let's say, my mom or dad, right? If they want to go shopping, usually they go into the city, they go to some shop, and then there is the standard salesperson, they help them and all that stuff. So there is this offline shopping experience that is still predominant how people shop, right? On the other hand, there is the younger generation, like the teenagers, they're growing up now. They are basically digital native. They have smartphones, they pretty much, they know exactly how to use those things, and they're more, of course, very open to all kind of new ideas on how to shop. So what that means for fashion is that we have, at the end of the day, this one more emerging digital native crowd that are open to all kind of innovations, including what I mentioned earlier, things like, I think, really this virtual try-on, that there is ways that people can experience how fashion looks at them without even going to the shop and trying it out, which is a lot of pain and effort if you do it. But then also the older generation, what can you still do to make it easier for them and convince them, so that at the end of the day, is smaller, the overall percentage of offline is shrinking, hopefully, right? I think that's the key thing and the challenge, and it's not easy to do, right?
I still buy my shirts offline. I need the personalization to be better, I think.
Yeah. See?
That's not a comment on the shirt that I'm wearing, by the way. So one last question from me, and then we'll open it up. So let's say you're trying to attract great talent at Zalando. What's the vision that you sell them on the amazing stuff you're working on there? Like, how do you pitch that?
Yeah. So what I just mentioned, it is. I think we're still here at the early stage in terms of innovation around fashion. I mean, we have done definitely in the past few years, and not just we, but in the industry, you can see other companies, Outfittery, and in the US, Zappos. There's a lot of basically effort in general there on figuring out how we can innovate in fashion. On the Zalando side, really the focus is on innovating around fashion and figuring out what we can do with it going forward. So I think the looking at this vision, and this is basically the purpose, is reimagine fashion for the good of all. It's Zalando purpose. So once you know this, there's a lot you can do, right? So then people then usually get excited to work when they have particular problem area. That could be, let's say, a technology, could be related maybe to some special aspects of deep learning, right? But then they get excited when they see, okay, if I do this, how can I now do something for the greater good, right? How can I help others? It's usually about helping others. It's that really what brings in a lot of motivation for people, right? And I think that's pretty much the pitch, right? There is a big vision to really advance the fashion, what you can do with fashion. But it's at the end of the day, it's really about providing and enabling this type of innovation so that people can come up with ideas to pretty much help others to innovate on fashion, right?
Yeah. That's great. I am totally sold. You sold me. So let's open it up to the floor. Does anybody else have questions out here? Yes, at the front.
Me? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the talk about AI is always like how it's like threatening the existing world in a way. And if Zalando as a marketplace is kind of bringing together buyers and sellers, so it's kind of a user interface for shopping, when does AI disrupt marketplaces?
Yeah, that's also a hard question. I think it's always difficult to say when, right? A lot of things can happen. I see that as the AI efforts become more mature over the next 2 or 3 years, I would say, I probably would think that the AI also then is more embedded into the business transactions level, right? It becomes more integrated there as well. Then see how this will unfold. It's really hard to tell. But there's a lot of work had been done even 20 years ago, 30 years ago about agent technology, right? And now if you can take this a little step forward, you can now actually make those even smarter. You can train them to do certain things. You can then, of course, they can become more autonomous to making even decisions, right? And then where will this end, right? Hard to tell. But it is exciting to see how it evolves. So.
Who else? Just one? Okay, you had your hand up there.
That
was so. How do you create the digital models that you're using for this personalization that you were talking about? What do you use to
for the try-on,
virtual try-on models?
Yeah, this is also a good question. There is a lot of so the way we tackle usually things is by exploration, meaning trying out a lot of cool things and see what sticks and what works. I've seen, for instance, last year there were some new of these Tango devices with these 3D cameras. So obviously some with smartphones, right, and see what you can actually do with them. There's all kind of limitations. On the other end, you can go really on the hardware side, really can go crazy if you think about these bigger scanning devices, 3D scanning devices that you, for instance, see at the airport, right? So of course they become much bigger, but the precision goes up tremendously. And then of course there's all kind of middle ground in between, but at the end of the day, nobody really knows what works best. So there's a lot of user research, seeing acceptance also, if this is something some people would actually do. So there's a lot of open questions. But at the end of the day, yeah, we need to figure out what is a good way for instance, capturing this data. What do users actually feel comfortable with exposing and uploading? Because usually when users are willing to share if they see some benefit and there is some concrete something that they can get back out of it, right? So it's a very hard problem, and that's why this is one of these exploration or research topics, and it's a little bit also more longer term because I'm sure that it is complex and it takes the time to make some good progress.
Super. I think that's probably all the time we've got. But Reiner, thanks so much. It's been great to chat to you. Reiner, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks.
And thank you, Ed, as well.